Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being patient as we've had a little bit of a late start. I welcome you all and thank you for coming here today. I'm Dr. Abigail Kaufman-White with the Department of Social Work. And unfortunately, April Lindela, who is my partner in this project and this training, is unable to be with us today. Sort of last-minute circumstances came up, but she will be here tomorrow to be conducting part of the training for you tomorrow. So we're going to, and because of those changes, we've had a little bit, some adjustments we're making as we go here today. So bear with us with some of those changes, but we're going to go ahead and start, and Dr. Judd Sojourn is going to open our, he's faculty with the Center for Native American Studies, and he's going to open our event with a moment of thankfulness. Okay, so now it's my job to tell you a little bit about why I'm here and why I'm grateful that all of you all are here, and then to give you a moment to think about why you are here and what you hope to gain out of your participation today, and hopefully many of you will be here for tomorrow's portion of the training as well. So why I'm here has to do with the fact that when I came to Northern Michigan University, I was introduced to the Center for Native American Studies and the programs that they have for students at the undergraduate level. And I was immediately immersed in the Department of Social Work and wasn't able very well early in the process to become connected with the center, even though I recognize the importance of doing that as a social work educator. Luckily, April has her eyes and ears out for opportunities to bring Native American studies to the forefront of the education at NMU. And she became aware of a federal grant opportunity through the Department of Justice, Office of Victims of Crime, which many of you in the room I know are familiar with. And this was a federal grant opportunity for rural parts of the country, serving indigenous communities where the federal government was recognizing that there is a tremendous gap in the workforce, in that they have difficulty recruiting people to work in victim services, indigenous communities, and then even once they come, have a hard time getting folks to stay. And we know how important it is for folks to stay in a career field in order to be effective and have maximum impact on the clients that they serve. And so April and I came together to decide how we could combine our curriculum in order to become a pathway for people who are interested in this career. And so we have information on the back tables about our new 3 degree programs, actually, 2 at the undergraduate level and 1 at the graduate level, that combines coursework from the Center for Native American Studies and social work courses so that folks can get a specialized type of training preparing them for this work. We were lucky to bring in Leanna Loonsfoot when we were writing the grant, who was working as the shelter director at Keweenaw Bay Indian Community, and she had a lot of direct insight into what she saw as some of the reasons or sort of root factors for why there was a problem with recruitment and retention in this particular workforce. And so, and I'll just describe a little bit about that. And Leanna, at any point you want to add to this, you can. But essentially, she was saying that she had, in her program specifically, but that she was working with people across the region, noticing that there were a lot of volunteers and staff who were working in victim services programs who were members of the indigenous communities they were working in and had sort of historical and community connection, but maybe didn't have sort of the formal education around social work or counseling that they needed to maybe be promoted or that kind of thing and stay working in victim services. And then on the other hand, you also had some non-native folks who were coming in without much education around historical factors, cultural humility, and those kinds of things that would help them engage with the community and therefore be effective in their jobs, and were likely to then leave as well. And so this training and the 3 degree programs are really designed to get at both of those groups of people. We want folks who are looking to increase their formal education, to think about coming to NMU and getting social work degrees. But we also want folks who are already sort of going down the social work path, interested in learning more about Native American studies and getting that education before they enter the workforce. And so if you open your packets that you got upon walking in the door, you will find a sort of third of a sheet of paper that outlines what the learning objectives are for these trainings. And these are essentially our ideas about the things that we think it might be important for folks to learn about. Over the next few days. But what I would really like you all to do is to take advantage of that nice notebook that they included in the registration packets, and hopefully you have a pen available. If not, we have some extra. And take a few moments to think about a time when you had an experience where you were attempting to build a relationship with another person, and that could be that you were either the person who was in the helping role or you were the person who was being helped. And something about cultural differences got in the way of building that relationship. And if you could just take a few moments to think about that quietly to yourself and maybe jot some notes about what that experience was like, that would be helpful. Excuse me, once you sort of have that scenario in your head, some ideas of what that experience was like, then think about what strategies you used or the other person used that were helpful to sort of bridge those gaps. And then maybe think about some things that occurred that made that situation worse. Kind of think about both the positive and negative strategies that you may not have thought were strategies at the time, but looking back on it, you might see some of what was going on. And if it hasn't come out already in what you're writing down, write down what you wish the other person knew. Okay, and so now I'm going to invite some folks to share. And this will also be an opportunity to introduce yourself and for us to get to know who else is in the audience and what perspective they're bringing to the table. So I'd just like a few folks to who'd be willing to just sort of share a couple of their thoughts, not their whole scenario that they wrote down, but something that they think is important for them to remember or for our audience to remember as we're getting trained in cultural humility and mindfulness today. And if you will, sort of share your name, share your current role, and maybe what brought you here today.
Hello, my name's Isabel. I work for the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. I always try to grab an opportunity where I can attend training in regards to any Native American specific subjects, because that's awesome. So this happened a number of years ago. I was an Indian child welfare worker, and I was asked to provide testimony, expert witness testimony on a removal case. And as they were, one of the legalities that the court has to establish is their active efforts to prevent removal of Indian children. And so when that question was brought up in court, the caseworker at the time had stated, well, I didn't know they were Indian. They didn't look Indian. When I went into their home, they didn't have any Indian artifacts on the wall. So that to me was kind of shocking, even though it was maybe, I'd say maybe 10 years ago, to not engage the people that you're working with because you're at a level of removal of someone's children. So I did a little bit of education on my part. The court went into recess. The prosecuting attorney at the time had asked me, okay, well, you know, as your expert witness, what are your thoughts? I gave him my thoughts. I said, you know, just because they don't look, may not sound, or appear Indian doesn't mean that they're not. And I suggested the usage of the Indian outreach worker for the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, which is my role today. So, yeah.
Thank you very much for, first of all, for sharing, and second of all, for being the brave first one to stand up and do that. Anyone else willing to share?
I had to think long and hard about this because over the years, I'm not Native, but over the years I've had clients that I've seen that are, and I've always tried to be as sensitive as possible and listen to what they say. So just kind of going back, Shelley Ovink. And I'm mostly retired, but I still do a lot of domestic violence work, especially with men who are perpetrators. So the example I thought of was a man, this is quite a few years ago, who was ordered into my group, and he told me right away he was a Native, which is fine. And during our group sessions, where I use a lot of cognitive behavioral type work, he talked about using the sweat lodge. And although I'd heard that term, I didn't really understand what that meant. And so privately, I asked him to talk a little bit about that because he wanted to, I think, try and incorporate that somehow in his treatment. But it's not something I'm familiar with, and nor am I in the sweat lodge with him to know what's going on. So when you asked the question about what else do I need to know or did I want to know, I wanted to understand that process more to see what kind of help he might be getting from that process. It sounded like it was a lot of self-discovery, and that's a wonderful thing for the men in groups to go through, is learning more about themselves and their motivation. In terms of what I wanted to do, I still wanted to make sure that he got the skills and the thinking of the model that I was using. So there was a little bit of a frustration there sometimes when I felt like I was fighting this unknown spirit out there. But overall, I thought it went really well, and he was a very gentle soul, which was also very nice.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, well, I appreciate those of you that did share. Because I wanted to make the point that while some of us call ourselves professors and are here to talk about specific topics that we have some level of expertise in, really this is a classroom where you all are bringing tremendous experience to the table, and I think that it's important that we learn from each other as a part of this process. And so we will take opportunities over the next day and a half to allow you all to share with each other and with us about your experiences so that we can all learn as a part of this process. Okay, so I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Michael Yellowbird, who is with us today, who is going to be presenting to you all for essentially the rest of the afternoon. We'll take a little break a little later on. But we are very fortunate to have him here today. He is one of the few American scholars in social work that has made this very important connection about understanding Native American studies and informing social work practice with Native American studies. Dr. Michael Yellowbird has recently accepted a position as Dean of the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Manitoba in Canada, and will be transferring there this summer. So I said I hate that we are losing him to Canada because he's been at University of North Dakota most recently. Dr. Yellowbird is a citizen of 3 affiliated tribes, the Mandan, the Hidatsa, and the Arikara. He joined the North Dakota State University faculty in the fall of 2014. He has held faculty and academic administrative appointments at the University of British Columbia, University of Kansas, Arizona State University, and Humboldt State University. He is a professor and the director of he's transitioning as the director of Tribal Indigenous Studies program at North Dakota State. His teaching, writing, research, and community work focus on Indigenous peoples' health, leadership, cultural rights, the effects of colonization and methods of decolonization, decolonizing social work approaches, neurodecolonization, and neuroscience, mindfulness and contemplative practices, ancestral lifestyle, and the rights of Mother Earth. Please welcome Dr. Michael Yellowbird.
Okay, walk around, yeah. All right, for some reason this is updating on me now. I can't see it. Oh, there. Okay, now I can see it. I want to start just by thanking you for that introduction, and also thanking the people whose traditional territory I'm on. I believe this is Ojibwe territory. It's good to be in your territory here. I've never been to Marquette, Michigan before. Maybe in another life I was here, but not in this life. So I'm really glad to be here, and thank Andrew for carting me around, picking me up late last night, and for the invitation to be here. Come at a time when there's a lot of transitions going on in my life, and as you just heard, I accepted a position as the Dean of the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Manitoba. I'm excited about that, happy about that. But also another transition, for me, I guess, is the loss of one of my mentors, Dr. Ronald Lewis, who was considered the the father of American Indian social work. Probably most of you haven't heard of him. Maybe you've read of some of his work, but he was a guy who published extensively in American Indian social work, and he was my mentor when I was a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. When I was transitioning from being a BSW student, I'd lived on the reservation, on the Fort Berthold Reservation, finished my degree, which is kind of interesting because I never planned to go into social work. I was a music major and a Phi Ed major when I was in the university. And then I ended up taking some courses in social work and some in special ed. And I was really very tired of school by the time I finished getting to the end of my bachelor's degree. So I asked my advisor at the time, what degree am I closest to? He said, well, you're close to your degree in special ed and social work. I said, which one's closer? He said, go one more class in social work. I said, I'll do that. So that's how I got into it. It's a rather inauspicious way of getting into that. But I understood social work well from that level because one of the things that it was geared towards was trying to make a change and a difference in the community. I grew up on a reservation, Fort Berthold Reservation, in a small town called White Shield, and grew up with a lot of the trauma that you hear about today, the historical trauma stuff. Witnessed a lot of death, a lot of morbidity and mortality growing up. And I can really understand why, their need for studies like, or theories like adverse childhood experiences. So as I've gone on later, I've studied a lot about that and looked at the neuroscience behind a lot of this stuff, plus many other sciences in the life sciences. So at that time when I just wanted to say this about Ron Lewis, and if you get a chance, Google him and look him up on and the accomplishments, the things he's done. But he was my professor and a mentor at Milwaukee. When I finally finished my MSW, and I wanted to dedicate this presentation to his memory, was he said, and I was ready to get out of the MSW. He said, Mike, he said, and he said a lot of things to me I've written down. But one thing he said is that, you can't go back to the reservation and go home and hang a couple feathers on a program and think it's a Native American program. He said it doesn't work that way. He said you have to really get deep into the knowledge of the people and the knowledge of your tribe and the traditions. He said they've been here for a long, long time, longer than Columbus was ever around. And he didn't use the word decolonization, but that's what he was talking about, was about to go back and to put aside some of the stuff that we were learning in classes, to go back to the knowledge and the intelligence of our tribal ways and customs, which I've spent a lot of time doing. And so he was the person that sort of prompted me, I guess, along the way. He just passed away a few weeks ago from cancer, and he's being buried in Oklahoma. So I really admired him because he was at Standing Rock, or not Standing Rock, but he was at Wounded Knee, and he was also at Alcatraz Island, and then he came and he was a professor at the time. So I knew he was someone that was deeply involved in activism as well as policy. He was one of the original innovators. You talked about child welfare, of putting together the law in Indian child welfare. So he was pushing that and did a lot of work in Washington. So I just wanted to mention that. One of the primary drivers in my life is transition into the spirit world, and wish him well on his journey. So I want to talk today about privileging Indian ways of knowing in victim services. So I was thinking about how do I tie this to victim services, and one of the things that I did is I just finished a big report for the 7th generation in Arcata, California, and I looked at 7 different anti-violence programs led by Aboriginal women in Alaska. And I did a lot of interviews and used qualitative research called appreciative inquiry, and talked about the strengths of those programs. I'm not going to talk. This is not what the report is about. But when you mentioned about how important our victim services were, I had some really interesting findings that I came up with in terms of violence and where violence comes from, and how violence was mediated in traditional ways, which we don't do right now. We don't even do the prevention for violation or for violence. So I wrote that report up, published it, and made a lot of recommendations, and they took it to them for, I think they had a Women's Day at the UN this year. So that report was published there, the one that I wrote. So I was very proud to contribute to this effort, against the violence against missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So some of this work that I'm doing now has a lot to do with the mind and the brain, the brain being the most powerful ally we have, or it can be the greatest enemy we have. And so in this particular first slide that I have is my oldest daughter. Her name is Arundhati Tirakoka Yellowbird, and she is 12 years old now. This was when she was about 10 years old, meditating in our backyard. But, I know that meditation to some people may sound like it's an Eastern thing, but when I've looked at the research, all tribal people around the world have used contemplative practices in order to develop their neuronal networks for well-being, for insight, for enlightenment. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about how the medicine wheel sort of brings us all together and how it's critical to social work knowledge, and also thinking about Indigenous studies knowledge. I think in this presentation that we can learn from our Indigenous ancestors and why they were correct in their worldviews, how they lived, how they practiced healing and created community. And some caveats here. The warning is, living like a Westerner can be very hazardous to our health, right? I want to share throughout this talk a number of terms and concepts that I think are really important for us to understand as Indigenous scholars and as social workers, right? And this is cutting edge stuff I'm working on now in a book. So I get into terms of neuroscience, the human microbiome that I call the new great circle of life, genetic science in terms of what we inherit from the past, like epigenetics. That's where the whole thing historical trauma comes from, but historical trauma doesn't really have a good genetic study basis right now. It's just a term and a word out there. People talk about epigenetics, but it's a lot more complicated than that. And there's all of these come together in this particular medicine wheel model in terms of decolonization. So foremost is that our brain, that our genetics, the microbes that live inside of us, this new great circle of life, and the lifestyles that we had, that our ancestors had, were really shaped by the relationships that we had with our environment, And what really displays that, I think, beautifully, we've talked about it many, many times, is the medicine wheel, the sacred hoop, a symbol of harmony and balance, peaceful interaction with all living beings on earth. And I'm not just talking about the beings outside of us. We got a whole trillion, trillions and trillions of ecosystems of beings that living inside of us, our brains and our bodies, on our bodies, and that kind of thing. And all of these represent, the cycle of life, right? Birth, death, rebirth, and of course the cardinal directions and what those represent on all the elements and the connecting points. So there are these number of sacred sites in the world. This presentation is long, so I'm not going to go into the sacred sites, but the one I really want to talk about is the medicine wheel on Turtle Island. So the oldest medicine wheel I think that most of us know about is about 10,000 years old. That was in the Bighorn Mountains in Wyoming. I don't know, has anyone ever been there, to Bighorn Mountains in Wyoming? So one person, two people, 2.5 people? I've seen a half, I go halfway, all right? So it's really interesting if you've never been there, because this particular, if you look at this is like 10,000 years that this has been in existence on this mountain. And all those different spokes that go out, some people have different theories about them, how they're extending out to different parts of the universe, like a star calendar. But what we know about that medicine wheel is that people used to come to the medicine wheel from all over Turtle Island, and they used to pray there. And you can see it's at the edge of this mountain. And it was called the place of the eagles, because the eagles spend a lot of time, calling and screaming and, talking to one another as people were there. We know that people visited it a lot now and they leave different kinds of things, you know, in reverence to that or in connection to that. Here's a dream catcher here. Prayer offerings, feathers, tobacco ties, you know, prayer flags. When I think about prayer flags, you know, I think about in our own homelands, we sundance. I was a sundancer for many years. And what does it remind me of? Well, the Buddhist prayer flags, you know, that they're sending out prayers to all quarters of the universe. And so when you see these flags, you know, we realize that these colors are important to people. They're symbolic. They have meaning. Back home, we have a Sundance. And at the center of the Sundance is this tree with all these tobacco ties. And when we make the ties, we put prayers into them, intentions into them, good thoughts into them. And you know what? They're not just for us or our family. They're for everybody. Just like these flags in Tibet are for everybody, the prayers that go out. So Indigenous people are, you know, kind of connected in that way. And they're connected through a medicine wheel. There's a medicine wheel in Valley City, North Dakota. There's not many Native people that live there, so someone built this replica there. They must have liked it or something, but it's a replica of the one in Bighorn Mountains. Anyone ever go to school at Haskell Indian Nations University? Know anybody went there? Down there in Lawrence, Kansas? Well, this is a medicine wheel out there. I used to teach at the University of Kansas, just up the road, but I used to do a lot of lecturing at Haskell Indian Nations University. So one of the things that the students did is they this used to be a boarding school where kids were incarcerated. They were actually put into little jails and had little handcuffs for the kids. So what the students did is decolonize that land space. You know, they took the colonial spirit out of that and they replaced it with this medicine wheel. You see that spirit bird, water bird on the side flying to the west, and all the other symbols and the people gathering there. So it's used quite often. So I've traveled a lot and I've been invited to a lot of places in this Judaculla Rock in Cullowhee, North Carolina, Cherokee territory. This thing is, you know, thousands of years old, this rock. It's got all kinds of carvings in it. Hard to see. But when you get up close to see it, you can see that. I don't have a pointer here, but see if this works. Can't see that, okay. Do you have a remote with a pointer? No? All right. Just imagine I got a laser on the end of my finger. So right there, you can see that turtle there with that medicine wheel. Thousands of years old, way on the east side, away from Wyoming. You see all these other, you know, these weren't just Cherokee people. In fact, they probably weren't even Cherokee at that time. You know, maybe they were Cherokee. But these were tribes that came there, and this was kind of like you would see a board, you know, in the laundromat or something. Somebody come by and say, "I need a ride here," you know, I got to sell a bike here or whatever. And that's what they said. This was like the tribes were kind of talking to each other through these symbols. You know, people have come here. You know, we're the people of the stars. We're the people of the rivers. We're whatever we are. So if you can imagine, before child welfare and before all this stuff about victim services and stuff, that there was this teeming life that was going on here in Turtle Island. Very dynamic. So dynamic that we find it even in Utah. You see that spokes there on this big side, just like Devil's Tower. Not in the Devil's Tower, but in Bighorn Mountains. And there you see the circle again, the Hopi Indian Reservation. So either there was one Indian that got all over and did this, or there was, you know, or that, you know, these tribes were interacting with each other all over the place. The Mojave Desert, you see that sun symbol there, again, reaching out. On my own reservation at Fort Berthold, among the Mandan Hidatsa and the Rickará, you see that medicine wheel on the side of the hill. And in the early 90s, 1990s, some young people got together after a Sundance, and they made this medicine wheel. I was one of those young people at that time, so. But it was all put there so, you know, we could see that, you know, as we drove by. It was a prayer, you know. It's just a prayer. Anybody who drives by can see it. Okay. Some more here, you see that? Another ancient medicine wheel on the other side there. So let's get to more of the modern medicine wheel, right? So the medicine wheel I have here is one where it's got the mind, the body, the spirit, and the emotions. And, there you see different variations of it. The mind, now I've added some Western science to it. And a couple of ideas. There's a lot of ideas in here, really. These are just two I'm mentioning. Neuroplasticity. The idea that the brain can change. It can change its shape and its function when it's given new orders, when it's given new information, when it's given new, novel teachings like language or prayers or experiences. And neurogenesis, the fact that the brain can grow more brain cells that can be beneficial to us in many different ways, for learning, for memory, for performance, and even as into old age, when we're at risk of neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's or dementia or other dementias, we have enough what they call brain cells, cognitive reserve, so that we may never get Alzheimer's. We may get Alzheimer's, but we may never get the disease or the symptoms of it, because we have extra neurons growing in the brain, because we've pushed ourselves to learn more. On the other side, in the body, as I mentioned, is the human microbiome, and I'll go over all these things. The new great circle of life. Everything you ate today contributed to building your microbiome or keeping it stable or, inflaming it or whatever, right? And then I talk a lot about indigenous mindfulness, contemplative practices. I'll get to that. And finally, genetic inheritance, epigenetics, telomeres, molecular structures, cellular structures that have been colonized by stress, colonized by anxiety, colonized by settler colonialism, right? So we've got molecular and cellular structures in our body that go way beyond the ACEs that we can see on the outside, that are inside of us, that have been colonized. We need to decolonize these things by returning to some really basic teachings of our ancestors. So that's the medicine wheel, the holistic, and the culture, the experiences, the perceptions that we have as individuals shape our brain's plasticity, affects our DNA, our microbiome, the expression of our genes, changes our brain waves, alters neurotransmitters and modulators in our brains. It's pretty dynamic stuff, things that, we know now that are going on that we didn't know before. We have the benefit of now imaging. We have the benefit now of the Human Genome Project, the decade of the brain, where so many different studies were done, and we're kind of now in the time of the human microbiome and studying, all these life that lives on us or inside of us, getting a second look at that. So how do we heal from diseases of colonization? A lot of it, as you look at the bottom one near the red, we need to balance, who we are with a return to traditional practices, contemplative, mindfulness, dietary, movement, exercise, all these different kinds of things. So that's what's called decolonization, right? The idea, though, is that decolonization in the middle one, deconstructing colonial ideologies of superiority and privilege, Western thought and approaches is kind of where we're stuck in right now, right? We're stuck in a place where we have the violence, we have sickness and illness and disease, displacement, high mortality, high anxiety, unhappiness, those kinds of things, sort of permeate our world. So how do we begin to dismantle these structures, right? How do we begin to stop the perpetuation of the status quo and to address the unbalanced power dynamics that exist, right? Well, through decolonization, the revitalization, the valuing of indigenous knowledge and the revitalization of this knowledge, weeding out settler biases and approaches, that have impacted our way of well-being. Social work. People, I say, well, decolonization is about examining for settlers, about examining beliefs about indigenous people, who we are, what we knew, what we valued, and those kinds of things, right? It's not in the here and now. We have to go back and expand our lenses so we understand that indigenous people had a lot of firewalls and safeguards for a lot of things we see today, right? So many of them, and I'll talk about those. And settlers and the colonial world has to learn a bit about itself, right? How does it function? I mean, I'll tell you how it functions right now. We're looking at another, murder, suicide, or not suicide, but a murder at a high school in Colorado. You see that, following that in the news? Well, that's going to happen again. It's going to happen again. It's mass murders, right? And people asked me about this. I did an interview one time, and they said, well, what's your take on that? I said, young men, young women, young men do most of the massacres. I said, but young men in my tribe back in the day had many fathers. Not just one father. We had a lot of fathers. Uncles, were all fathers. First cousins of my dad were all fathers, and so on. So when a young male was acting out, or a young male had many fathers that he could seek advice from and be with, I said, overwhelmingly, these young men that have committed these mass murders, these young white men that have committed these mass murders in the United States, have been fatherless. One father doesn't do it. We knew that. Kids had many fathers and mothers in many tribes, right? Multi-parenting. Because kids go through these periods of estrangement, anger, anxiety, periods of confusion, right? And they need to be mentored through that. How do you do that in a tribal society? Any tribal hunter-gatherer society today you look at, you can see that same kind of thing. No one has one mother or one father. They have many aunties, many uncles, and they're shifted back and forth, back and forth. So now we have to deconstruct that, decolonize that a bit, because that's what exists in today's society. The lack of parenting, not from a single parent, but multi-parents. That's decolonization. So what does it look like as a process? There was the other world that existed, that we're going to talk a little bit about today, and through colonization and unnatural changes, it fell into this world where we talk about what we talk about today. All the statistics that are not good. We see some things that are good that are happening, but essentially we're living in a Western world. And when we say good things are happening, that means we're closer to a Western ideology or a Western way of living than we are to an indigenous way of living. That means we're graduating more kids from the schools, right? That means our mental health is what, settler psychologists would say, you've got good mental health, right? But that's not the end-all, be-all. We know that there are different measures we have to get back to. So let's say what we need to do in terms of to decolonize ourselves now is to strip away these harmful, invasive processes, beliefs, practices, and so on that have been imposed by colonizing structures, and then restore cultural practices, thinking, beliefs, and values that were taken away or abandoned during those periods, but they're still necessary for our survival today. Finally, it's birthing new ideas, thinking, technologies, which kind of, to me, brings me down to what I'm doing, is to try to bring Western technology to kind of revalidate for ourselves as indigenous people and for others that are the ways that our ancestors did and what we had worked. We don't believe it. We don't follow it, right? So it's important. Think about that. This world, we're in a free fall. Every day I pick up the paper, I see we're closer and closer to mass extinction. We're closer and closer to climate change. I just saw in the packet about climate change in the packet and get a chance to read the article, right? But, there's a way around a lot of this stuff, right? So let me talk just really briefly about neurodecolonization, which is a term I developed. And what does it mean? Well, I've studied the brain a lot. I had to get outside of social work and indigenous studies to focus on neuroscience and other life sciences. And the neurons in the nervous system in the brain that sort of, send signals back and forth, that's the first part of this term, neuro, right? That's kind of alive in us. The decolonization part of the term is anything that we can do to weaken the effects of colonialism and facilitate some kind of resistance or create opportunities that promote the use of traditional practices in contemporary life, right? So in the end, really what that means is I'm combining mindfulness practices with traditional and contemporary contemplative practices to begin to reshape the brain, to resculpt the brain, to change the body, to change the way the cells and the molecular systems, function or to decolonize at that level, and then begin to implement, different patterns of thought that will replace the negative patterns, So these healthy, new, productive ones, are really going to make a big difference. I'm so convinced of this work and this research is that I tell people frequently that I think you can change people dramatically in one generation, in a single generation, if we go back to some of these things that are very important for us to be doing. They're traditional. Some examples. Movement, intermittent fasting, getting proper sleep, meditation, collectivism, humor, laughing, and of course, other things like a sweat lodge, and I've got other things here too. So if we go back to this part of the mind, let's talk about the part of the mind here. What is neuroplasticity and neurogenesis and healing? And how do traditional healing contemplative practices sort of join up there? So what are the mindfulness things? Well, there's 8 of them that I've identified in the literature. And I've had to get outside of indigenous studies. Well, indigenous studies would include this, right? But outside of social work to begin to look at, anthropology, evolutionary biology, exercise physiology, looking at, neuroscience, all the other sciences. And what I found was some really interesting stuff, really interesting, that running, dancing, and singing, can reset our genetic expression and facilitate improved learning and conquer depression and anxiety, right? Is that something we do in practice? Probably not too much, right? What about sleep? I always tell social workers, if I was a social worker, if I was a supervisor, one of the things I would be telling you is that the first assessment, this is an assessment tool. How much did you run and move this week? Did you dance this week? You should be dancing about 3 times this week. Did you sing? What'd you sing this week, right? How about sleep? I'm going to ask you, how many people here slept out 8 hours last night without drugs? Okay, some hands went down. Hands went down. All right. So did you dream? Right? How many? So there's a few of you. Okay, a few of you folks. But it's typical. Most of you didn't sleep that 8 hours or even 7 hours or 6 hours. Disrupted. We'll talk about that. How many of you laughed today already? Belly laugh. Really laughed hard. Tears were coming out. Snot was coming out. Huh? Nobody? Some people laughed, yeah. Somebody way back. A couple really laughing back there, right? How big is your tribe? How many people hang out with more than 5 people? Nobody. Jeez. Antisocial people here. No, I'm kidding. So a couple, yeah. So how many people go and do something 4 or 5 times a week to hang out with some people? Nice group of people. Only about 3 people, 4 people maybe, okay? That's collectivism, right? Otherwise we go from work, we go home, see the same old faces, hear the same old arguments, and we go back to work, see the same old people, whatever, right? Intermittent fasting. Any fasters here? Anybody fast? A few people, okay? Not because you're broke, right? Just because it's good. Meditation. Any meditators, mindfulness meditators? A few, okay? How many people do a sauna? Sit in a hot sauna. 30 minutes at a crack, 170 degrees. Not too, a couple of people, yeah. Sweat lodges? Anybody do sweat lodge? No sweat lodgers? Do about 2 or 3 people. And last thing is how many people are outside? How much time do you spend outside? Somebody tell me. How many hours a day? What? Every day, how long? Over 1 hour. Okay, about an hour? Okay, who else? 2 or 3 hours. You're getting better, you're getting warmer. Anybody else? 2 or 3 hours. Wow. All right, okay. Well, let's take a look at this. This guy running here, that's me when I was younger. They all laugh too. Yeah. All right. I like that Indian humor, huh? So this guy's running from the cavalry here. All right. Anyway, you know, I didn't put this guy in there, the great circle of life, but I guess he is. He's parasites. How many of you have parasites? Well, everybody's got parasites, and you just don't know it, right? But we don't have as many parasites as we used to have. This is the humble rat tapeworm. You wouldn't necessarily want to go out and get a tapeworm, would you? Yeah. But one of the things is that, you know, native people, indigenous people, all of us evolved with parasites. Science is telling us now that, you know, we made a big mistake by killing off all the parasites in our body. Autoimmune disorders, mental health disorders, the great circle of life, man. You know, we put all this chemical and stuff into our bodies. And some of them are responsible for our well-being. We evolved. I don't know if this is ready to go here. I cannot locate the internet. Okay. Really? Really? Try one more time. It's not going to work? Got any tech people out there? So I'm going to just keep on talking while she fixes it.
We got you a rice knocker too.
What?
A rice knocker so you can point if you want to point.
So is it?
Can you exit out of this?
Yeah. So in this particular slide, this guy, anybody watch Sanjay Gupta, CNN? Does a lot of stuff. One's called Chasing Life right now. He's talking about, you know, people just extend their life. As we get older, we watch more of those, huh? You know, I was like, how do I extend my life another 5 minutes or something, right? Don't drink that Coke or something, right? But this particular slide, if we can get it up, talks about indigenous people, Indian people, about having no heart disease. And I don't want to go too far because I'm going to ruin my punchline here. But it's really pretty cool if we get into it, because I've got a couple more ones here too. Okay. I'm glad we got these tech people here.
When I'm out on the land, I feel like I'm a part of it.
So this is just the commercial
With
part
this
here.
lifestyle, I've
Yeah,
gone an
this-
awful lot,
this one.
and the
Yeah,
physical
but it's the
work on my
commercial.
body
This is
is
the commercial
great.
side.
So when I do get to lie in bed in a great mattress, I'm out like a light.
Yeah, so meh.
Every day that I wake up here and every night that I go to sleep here, I feel exceedingly blessed. For me,
We're not going to listen to you. So we're going to.
We heard these rumors about a population of people that didn't have heart disease. So we wanted to go deep into the Amazon rainforest. We wanted to live with the Chamane. That's the name of this indigenous tribe. We want to understand their lives. I realize that there are these true hunter-gatherers that are living off the grid, and of course they're going to be healthy. You think about their lifestyle, but the idea that they wouldn't have any evidence of heart disease seemed pretty hard to believe.
They don't have access to medical services. Without good services, it's easy to have infections and the parasites. Exposure to infectious disease can be protective.
Almost all of the Chamane live with some degree of parasitic infection. They typically got these parasitic infections early in life, caused a few days of illness, and then they live with this parasite in their body. They co-evolve, they cohabitate with this parasite. And the reason this is so important is because We know that so many of the diseases we talk about, whether it be heart disease or diabetes, are either ignited or worsened by our own immune system. But suddenly, if you give the immune system something to focus on, in this case, a parasite, it kind of modulates and buffers the immune system. So the immune system doesn't focus its attention inward. We live in these self-imposed hygienic bubbles in the United States in the pursuit of good health. But being too clean may not have been the answer. That may be the real secret to why the Chimani are so healthy. They don't take medications to get rid of parasites. They let the immune system behave the way that it's supposed to behave.
When I'm out on the land,
So I'm just going to escape from that and go back to the. So the point here is that what, this is, again, indigenous knowledge here, It's like these people, where do you think they get the parasites? They don't go down to Mexico and get them implanted. They get them from the soil or being outside, right? It's kind of hard to think about right now I think for most of us. It's like, oh, I don't think I'd want some parasites crawling around on me either. I wouldn't want a rat tapeworm, sort of swimming through my blood. But everything we're starting to understand now is that, if you listen, these Chimane Indians, don't have heart disease. They don't have cancers, colon cancers. They don't have depression or anxiety or violence in their community, right? This is kind of this, again, the great circle of life. When I think about it, when I think about a holistic model of social work or indigenous studies, it's to kind of get to all these pieces of it, right? Get beyond what we try to kill or what colonialism try to kill. Not only do they try to kill the Indian, they try to kill the parasite that kept the Indian healthy, right? Kept all people healthy. So, the first three, running, singing, and being in a fasted state, combining these practices, again, how many people run here? How many runners? So there's a few runners. Are you guys fast? Yeah. Yeah, one hand's going up. He's pretty fast. Used to be friends of my oldest son. He did when he lived in Madison. They both went to Van Nuys middle school together. I didn't know that. I was thinking, I don't know if I ever saw you around the house with my son Jason, but uh-oh. Anyway, running. So, singing, fasted state. So, this is Tarahumara Indian. I know Ojibways had great runners back in the day. I've read about Indian running. Great runners. They weren't fast as my tribe, but you guys had great runners. And running is part of who we are, right? That's part of our knowledge, movement. Why? Running makes us well, right? Everything that I've learned so far is that we're not living the way we're supposed to live. We're sitting too long. In fact, everybody stand up just for a minute. Take a stretch. We evolved to run. We evolved to move. We've got the biology and the physiology for it. We've got the lungs, we've got the legs, we've got the breathing apparatus, we've got the brains, we've got the hips and the knees and the feet. And something that's killing us right now is our shoes. No matter how cool they look, they're making our feet like this, instead of like this. Our ancestors evolved to have feet that were like this, that could grip the earth when they run, right? Light a cigarette. No, I'm kidding. You can sit down. Persistence running is in our heritage. You want healthy people, they run down their meals. When I was a kid, I tell people, you guys are going to laugh at this again, but I used to run down jackrabbits with the boys in the hood back home on the reservation. We did. We'd chase after them. We didn't have any games. We didn't have any TV. All we had was hanging out in the community, riding horseback, running, and chasing down jackrabbits, right? So we used to run after them, and we could run down a jackrabbit. Never knew why, but we'd run them down, catch them. We'd never kill them. We'd just kind of put them down on the ground and see how high they would jump. Well, we held their ears, then we'd let them go, you know. But I found out later this was called persistence running. We could run down a jackrabbit because it doesn't have the physiology that we have. We could sweat running across the plains on a hot July day, and that jackrabbit couldn't. So all we had to do was keep it in sight and track it until it got too tired and it couldn't sweat. So it was breathing hard, right? Horses can sweat. Most animals can't sweat, though. Dogs can't sweat. So humans evolved to hunt by running things down. It's in our genetics. That's why we're not healthy. That's why there's anxiety, depression, violence. That's why there is, all the health problems we have. Running is not only in our heritage, but it improves our physical and mental health. It improves our brain's working memory and processing speed and the brain's executive function. The executive function helps us delay gratification, avoid distraction, and helps us be cognitively flexible so we move from one thing to another thing without big problems or issues. Kids back in the day, hunter-gatherer kids, can do that. They can move from one issue to the next issue cognitively, pretty smoothly, because they have a high executive function from moving and running and playing. In today's society, kids don't move so quickly from one intellectual cognitive challenge to the next. They get hung up in between, frustrated. They have meltdowns, and then they're given medication, right? The cure for that is kids got to play and run. The executive function has to be built from a very early age. Running does this. It also improves something called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. That's a term that people should be learning at a BSW level. That's a term, that brain-derived neurotrophic factor. If you got a computer, you can Google it, but I can tell you this. It's a factor in the brain that causes your brain to have neurogenesis, or more cells to grow. It's called miracle grow for the brain. I forget the scientists that call it that. But the way I think about it, because I run a lot. I can still run pretty fast and pretty far. But I think about that because when I run, what's happening to my brain is I'm growing more neurons. Brain-derived neurotrophic factor. How do I remember that? Well, I sort of changed the acronym to Big Darn Native Fella, BDNF. And I do, it makes sense to me. Big darn native fella. So when I'm out there running, I see this big Indian guy in my brain with a big bucket of BDNF, and he's pouring it on my brain as I run. And my brain's growing. It's growing, it's growing. And it actually is. The science says it's growing. It's going to hopefully protect me from neurodegenerative diseases. I also have a genetic variant that's going to protect me from mental decline as I get older, if I get older. But BDNF, big darn native fella, it goes up. And another thing that happens when you run is you feel better. Why? Does anyone know why you feel better when you run? Okay, people said endorphins. Used to be endorphins was the old language. Now the language is endocannabinoids. Marijuana in the brain, man. It is. You got the same molecular structure in the brain as a cannabinoid. It's an endocannabinoid. You produce them when you run, you feel better, or when you move, or when you dance. Brain-derived neurotrophic factor goes up. Endocannabinoids go up when you're running. And you don't have to run too far or too fast, but you've got to get your heart rate up. You've got to get it going, right? Now, pharmaceutical science, clinical practice, those kinds of things, or any kind of synthetic drugs cannot even compete or come close to your own pharmacy that you have in your brain when you do these kinds of things, right? So what happens then too is more you run, it ignites or initiates what they call long-term potentiation. You know, your body gets the feeling of running. Sometimes all you do is close your eyes and you can just imagine yourself running. Guess what? You get a little lift. You get a little lift from the BDNF, a little lift from the endocannabinoid. And if you sit there and you meditate really hard and you're watching yourself run, your body doesn't know any different. Your brain doesn't know any different. It raises those chemicals in your body, right? It's a free run. It's a free ride, right? Drug-free. So we evolved to run. And let me show you something with another, hopefully this will work again. This is an indigenous woman. I don't know, this is that's not an indigenous woman, but oops. Skip the trial. Let's go back here. And Lorena Ramirez shows the tradition. If you're talking about, indigenous practices, she shows the heritage. Has anyone ever heard of her? Tarahumara, Native woman. Well, let's watch her. Let's watch her do her thing, and then I'll tell you a little bit about her.
Mi nombre es Lorena Ramírez Hernández, soy corredora rarana. Que me
Pues como digo, nosotros fuimos nacidos para correr, digamos desde cuando crecimos, porque tenemos la sangre de ramo.
Llena la canilla, que con llena bastante una guaya. Empecé guacho 10 kilómetros. Cuauhtémoc 42 kilómetros. Cuauhtémoc tercer lugar, primer lugar 18 años. Cuauhtémoc.
Pues siempre caminábamos, tras el archivo puede caminar dentro de 6 horas, 4 horas en la montaña. En esos tiempos podíamos caminar, digamos, unas 3 horas cargadas con cosas en la espalda, trayendo nuestros mandados para comida en la casa.
Nico llena la canilla tiba, si me España, un vestido blanco, sí, guarabes, no guarabes. Buena citada, parimagua, tenis, que venga, que es que venga, más Venezuela.
Cuando vamos a correr antes, siempre tomamos pinole y frijoles, lo que sería nuestra dieta, ¿no?, principal.
Llena la canilla y me parece cumplir inargua, la residu ilara, la llena canilla me parece cumplir nahuaba.
Estoy muy contento y estoy agradecido juntamente con Lorena. Yo espero que haya más invitaciones para otros países y espero que podamos encontrar un patrocinio allá. Y pues yo quiero que algo haya bueno para nosotros, para comunidades de rarámuris, que haya apoyo o lo que se pueda hacer.
So running. This isn't a talk about sports or recreation. This is a talk about indigenous knowledge and about what we know, what we evolved from, where we came. And I'll tell you a little bit about Lorena is that she's the best in the world. You know, she's humble. I win a few first places, you know, but she beats the best in the world. All these women from all over the world that have these Nike tennis shoes, and they get all the best trainers and all the best facilities. They have, you know, all the gear, and, you know, they stop and they eat, you know, the high nutrient density foods as they go along, and she runs along and whips everybody's butt. It's in the blood, like the young man said. That's in all of our blood, the heritage, you know, but it's closer, I think, to me, in indigenous people's blood, because we're not that far away from where our ancestors were, you know. When we got horses, that kind of changed things a bit. But those cultures that have remained horseless or carless, again, very, very healthy, mentally, physically, spiritually healthy people. So you can imagine what's going on with her and the people that are their running heritage, right? About how good their brains are working and their cognitive flexibility and their brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It'd be interesting to do a brain scan on some of these people to kind of see the density of neurons in their brains and how it contributes to their mental health. Movement is so important that, again, I'm talking about endocannabinoid concentrations following singing and exercise in healthy volunteers. So here's what we know from this particular research. Singing significantly increases these endocannabinoids in postmenopausal females. Dancing, in terms the mood and cycling on endocannabinoids, also had positive effects in this group, singing and dancing. And you think about indigenous people, all the singing and dancing they used to do, then it was outlawed by colonialism. Now we hardly do that anymore, except we have a powwow, and that's good enough. But these guys did it all the time. They'd wake up singing, go to bed singing, dancing. So we know the evidence is there, you know, that improving mood, reducing stress, anxiety, enhancing memory, protecting the brain functioning, and of course, reducing pain. All these different kinds of things. So we put it together here again. It's a grass dancer. Mr. Smooth.
The boys, we're asking for 2 starts.
Mr. Smooth, huh? So, endocannabinoid concentrations, if you imagine people dancing like that a lot, singing like that a lot, we're going to see that, of course, rise in those endocannabinoids, people feeling good. And of course, what it says here is that, you know, this biochemical evidence in that increase in these novel signaling messengers, well, the signaling to the brain, besides, you know, improving mood, what it's signaling to the brain and to the body is thrive. These are all called thrive signals, right? Reducing stress, reducing anxiety, mood, happiness. When we're not moving like that, you know, and we're getting a lot of, negative news or in a negative situation, the body gets the decay, you know, message rather than the thrive, signaling. So this is why I think there was so much of that going on with tribes. A lot of singing, a lot of dancing, and of course, when we study Western science, we see the same thing. So I mentioned sweat lodges and saunas. What's really cool about this is this real recent research that's been coming out about heat shock proteins. So in order to benefit from a sauna, I mean, you can go in sauna, but in order to benefit from a sauna, you have to go in frequently, like 4 or 5 times a week. And you have to stay in for about, 20 minutes. Maybe 2 sessions are going to be really good, but it's got to be hot, right? Your body adapts to that, right? There's an adaptation period that goes on. And I remember the first time when I was in a sweat lodge years ago when these mothers came in. They were pregnant. I didn't think anything of it. And then later on, they'd bring the nursing babies in a sweat lodge. Anybody ever seen that? Nursing babies? And I thought, oh, this is going to be tough on the baby. But the baby just snuggled up to mom. And I thought, didn't cry, went out. And then later on, I found the research that says, yeah, guess what? Babies do fine. Little kids do fine in the sweat lodge as long as they're not like, you don't put them through too many protocols of it. But, they have adaptation capacities, and I'll show you some slides for that. But the thing we know most about, doing a sweat lodge, but especially a dry sauna, is that these heat shock proteins are in our cells. And what do? Well, we have proteins in our body that, come and go. But one of the things is that proteins sometimes can misfold. Misfolding I first read about when I read about mad cow disease. When you read about mad cow disease, you see that what they call prions that exist in mad cows, then the proteins, get into that, and then they get misfolded. People eat them, we get misfolded proteins, then we get mad cow disease. We get our own source of protein folding as we get older, or we get sick or whatever, and our proteins fold. And as they fold, we get diseases, especially neurodegenerative diseases. But people that go into a sauna, like indigenous people did, have done all over the world, gone into these hot places, for prayer and for healing and for health, have been able to avoid this excessive protein folding, right? Because high levels of health or heat shock proteins can not only stop protein misfolding, but it leads to longevity, disease protection, healthy skeletal muscles, as well as it reduces anxiety and depression. Just another really easy factor that indigenous people have done all over the world, right? So, sleep. How long have we been going? Do we need a little break right now, or do you think? Or let me finish sleep, and then we'll just take a little break, right? All right. So this is my res dog here. But you guys have res dogs? The reservations around Michigan? You guys heard of res dogs? Okay, so we were like, what's res dog, right? So social workers, if you guys know what a res dog is, I don't know if it'll work in this crowd, but this res dog here, you look at him laying there, he doesn't have a job. Lives with his mom, got puppies all over the reservation. He owes puppy support, and on and on. Usually social workers that kind of work with people in the res really laugh, because, anyway. So, sleep. Sleep. How could something so fundamental become so important in such a epidemic today? Sleep disorder, right? Again, you know, if you were doing an evaluation or you're doing a checklist, you know, for people or looking at folks, you know, how many times or how much have you slept this week, right? If we don't get enough of the sleep that we need, which most of us aren't getting now, we disrupt our CRs, circadian rhythms, right? It's to the point now where we understand that the circadian rhythms are a molecular clock. I mean, this even goes with eating. Finding out with eating is like, it's huge now in the world of molecular studies and food and when the timing of our eating, right? Anyway, so when our molecular clock, you know, breaks down, you know, when we doesn't rise and fall as it should, and we stay up last night or look at the screen, it really disrupts our sleep and increases our risk for all these different illnesses, diabetes, heart disease, so on, and even dementia. We know now from research, brain imaging research, that people don't sleep well, their brain actually shrinks. We know that people that are sleeping well every night probably have a much higher or less probability of getting Alzheimer's disease or neurodegenerative diseases. Because one of the things that happens is that when you sleep and your brain is in that third level or at least 2.5 levels of deep sleep, the brain begins to relax, open up a bit. And the cleaning, you know, from the brain's chemicals that goes to the brain cleans the brain and cleans out the amyloid proteins in the brain. And once it cleans them out, it takes them out through a lymphatic system that your brain has, drains them out. Your mind is sharp the next day. That's why when you wake up and your mind is sharp, means your brain is cleaning out the junk in there. If we don't sleep well, we're building up excess amyloid proteins in our brain. So that's a warning to everybody, right? That research is pretty strong right now that people are looking at and saying that's an epidemic, you know. And things like Alzheimer's disease are, you know, forecasted to get worse and worse because of all these things I'm talking about, the lack of movement, the lack of sleep, the lack of, you know, exercise, the lack of, you know, being in places where we can't stop the protein folding. And now we're in this place where we have enough science to tell us that we have to figure out a way to get back to sleeping, you know, in sync with the sun going up and down, right? The molecular clock, circadian rhythm. So we're colonized by cell phones, tablets, televisions. We have a floodlight society. And it's called now the blue light of doom when you look at your watches or you look at your tablets or whatever. Now you have an option to switch it down at night so it turns into, you know, like an orange light or something. We know for kids and for adults, sleep is crucial for development. Poor sleep, learning disabilities increase. What's pretty critical about this is also knowing that when you're not healing during the course of a year, you're not getting better from colds and that kind of thing, is that, you know, the proteins that are released during sleep that fight infections are reduced. There's not much you can do about that. And people are getting a lot of antibiotics, which of course disrupts the human microbiome. Growth hormones, if you're losing muscle, you're not as strong as you used to be because of sleeping, then you know why, because growth hormones are one of the things that help us maintain healthy muscle, right? Toxic fat colonizes the body, and it's all there for all of us. Poor sleep affects our memory, language is difficult to learn, and of course, one of the things that when we breathe in and out, deep breath from the belly, big bellies, I say, are sexy because you get nice big breath from the belly, breathe in and out. The body gets the signal then again, safety, and you know, you're at ease, and of course, it's the circadian rhythm of the breath that brings about the health. So let's go ahead and take a break. I guess maybe about 5 minutes, 5, 10? 10 minutes. Take a 10-minute break. So I guess I'm going to get started again, folks. How long are we going? So, how many of you work in a place where there's a lot of humor, a lot of laughter, pulling pranks on each other, like when your boss is going to sit down, you pull the chair so he hits the ground. You used to put down a whoopee cushion when your boss is going to sit down, right? Or or you at home, you take off the shower head and you put some like a pill with dye in there, and then when your husband or wife takes a bath, that turns all red, So. No? Ah, yeah. All right. So here's the thing. Yeah. Violence? Oh, yeah, someone would, yeah, okay. All right, they wouldn't think it's funny? Is that what you're saying? Yeah, probably not, okay. All right. Well, it's in our genes, folks, and some people have it more than others. Laughter, humor. And we know that, for some people, humor doesn't come very easily. And for other people, it comes very easily, right? But the difference probably is in the DNA. That's what research is showing now. And it's really interesting because you find a lot of this particular genetic variant, it's called a serotonin transporter gene, STG, is what it's called, STG, or the 5-HTT-LPR, which is the variant there, the allele. If you have this particular allele, the short allele, you're probably a person that is going to laugh easier, enjoy humor more, right? And I grew up in a family like that. Loved to laugh. In fact, I was just with a couple of uncles and my aunt a couple of days ago. We sat there and we went to this Himalayan yak, and everybody's sitting there eating, and we were like, all laughing at our table, just, telling stories about the old days and whatever. But that's very characteristic of people from my tribal community. A lot of laughter, a lot of humor, a lot of storytelling and teasing, and humorous kinds of things. Well, and, my brothers and I were like that a lot. We'd do a lot of things and laugh about it later. And, my ex-wife, though, she didn't have much humor, so she didn't think it was funny what we did, so. But it was true, we were very different in terms of sense of humor. But here's the catch point here. Laughing increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And when you have belly laughs and you laugh a lot, gosh, I found this great, let me see if I can find it real quick here. I found this commercial I wanted to include in the presentation, but I forgot to put it in, so I'm going to show it to you real quickly if I can get to it. But what we know is that, laughter is contagious, right? So, it's contagious, it's medicine, oops. Coke. Not that kind of Coke. But this is a commercial I found when I was looking at humor. I thought, oh, this is kind of interesting. I wonder what folks will do in a crowd if I take it. So I want you to just sort of let yourself go and kind of go with the moment here, right? So All right, we're going to get away from the Coke there, but it's a Coke commercial, but I don't know. What'd you think? How'd that strike you? Anybody? Yeah. Oh, I thought the cameraman was raising his hand. He's just adjusting the camera. It's like anybody? Make you want to laugh? Yeah? Yeah. You didn't, wasn't socially acceptable, though, to crack up like that, right? Can't do it, man. You know, we got to be serious. Talking about violence and stuff here, you know. But it's a human emotion, very, very important human emotion that we realize is not expressed enough anymore. You know, if you sat there stone-faced and you're like, what the hell's funny about that, right, kind of thing, it may be, you know, you don't have the genetic variant, right? You do other things well, maybe, you know. But what we know about the research, though, is this. In the studies, I don't know if I have it in here. Maybe I've got it in here. But we know that people with this short allele that like to laugh like that flourish in a positive environment where there's a lot of laughter. There's a lot of smiles. There's a lot of storytelling. There's humor, right? That's people do well. People that go to a negative environment where that's absent suffer more. They get depressed easier. They don't feel well. They eat more at work. You know, they have to get up more. They get distracted more easily. There's all these different kinds of things that the research is showing now when people who have these particular alleles aren't laughing, right? What we know then, the next level, collectivist cultures like indigenous cultures all over the world are significantly more likely to carry this funny gene, the 5-HTTLPR gene, right? Across 27 nations. I don't know if I have the, it doesn't look like I have the slide in there. But again, laughing increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So, funny people, people that laugh, heal more, right? I'd like to see some research, I haven't seen any research yet, about people who laugh a lot probably get less dementia, less depression, those kinds of things, right? So when you think about agencies, you think about schools, you think about institutions, that's not the norm. People normally don't laugh like that, right? So I just wanted to show you that, you know, again, it's not just something that we say it makes you feel good. It's actually a genetic variant that helps us express that. And then the payoff comes, memory gets better, learning gets better. All right, so now we're going to turn to the effects of fasting and intermittent fasting on brain health. One of the things, hello, one of the things I know about this is that, you know, we evolved to fast. The world we live in today is an unnatural world. We have at our disposal too many things, right? Like bikes and cars and, you know, cell phones, those kinds of things, you know, so we're distracted or we don't exercise. But we also don't fast a lot because food is so readily available to us, right? And that's okay, that's good. But manufacturers don't care, you know. They put stuff in it to make us want more of it. Sugar, salt, fat. 3 essential things in our evolutionary heritage, right? Salt we needed because we came from climates and we came from ancestors that needed salt. We still have evolutionary markers in us that when we get salt, we want to get more salt. Salt is a mother. Salt, like water, is life. Salt is life because if we live in a climate without salt, we can dehydrate. Salt helps us maintain water, right? Now today we've got an excess of salt in our foods. Manufacturers put it in there because they have the best minds that work for them that say if you put salt in there, it's going to trigger this evolutionary sort of urge to eat more salt because you don't know when the next salt lick is coming up. It may sound strange, but that's true. Our bodies don't function consciously up here. They function with an evolutionary memory that says we need salt, right? We also, and salt is, you know, again, without salt, salt is death. Without salt, we don't have We can't, maintain our hydration. Sugar is the same thing. Glucose. We didn't get a lot of glucose back in the day unless we ran into honey, or ate some flour or something that had, or maple syrup, like in this part of the country. So now manufacturers put more sugar into products. The brain and the evolutionary body says, sugar, source of glucose, I need it for energy, to run from the saber-toothed tiger, right? Doesn't sound like reality, but this research has been done now to kind of look at, when the body tastes sugar, how it activates the brain, and it activates the same neural pathways as things like cocaine does, right? It's a quick high, a quick lift, right? Dopamine happens when you eat sugar. Your dopamine feel-good chemical goes up, right? Just like when you eat refined carbs, quick source of sugar. Final thing is fat. Our ancestors grew big brains because they ate meat and fat. So when we taste fat, fat tastes good to us, to most of us. And so we want more fat, right? Fat is something, somebody asked me about fry bread, so that's not traditional. Fry bread's not traditional. So that's true. It's not traditional. It's a food that came after colonization. But what's traditional about fry bread is the fat. That our ancestors, if you're eating fry bread during the winter time, I said the brain mimics the same thing because that's the time we got in a lot of fat. Fat from the deer or the buffalo or whatever, fatty fish or whatever it is. We needed fat to get through the winter. So we have generation upon thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years of generation of storing fat so we could get through, right? We see the bears do that and so on, storing fat. We do the same thing. We did do the same thing. So fat is something that triggers within us a drive to eat more of it because the evolutionary part of our brain says it's going to run out. So manufacturers got us there. They tricked us. And so it leads to overabundance of food, overeating, we get sick. That's where fasting comes in. Because if we did all those things, the one way we corrected it was by not eating. Not eating is just as important as eating. In my book right now, today, it's even more important, right? So I don't know if people fast here or do intermittent fasting. I was just talking with Andrew about it. I'm coming up to 24 hours. When I travel, I only eat once a day. Most of the time, I fast for anywhere from 18 to 20 hours a day, eat 2 small meals a day, and I still run. So I know the science behind it. Everything they told us is that you have to eat to run. Not true, right? You have to eat enough calories during the day in order to beat, anything that would cause harm to your body. So I just know I got to get in my 2,000 calories a day or 1,900 calories a day or 2,100 calories a day. Plus, if I run, I'll put a few extra calories in, nutrient-dense things. But we evolved to do that kind of thing, right? So what about fasting? Mark Mattson, chief of the Laboratory of Neurosciences at the National Institute on Aging, if you're interested in this guy, I would suggest watching his TED Talk and suggest reading about him, because now we're understanding how fasting can cure many diseases and illnesses, right? And guy's he's premier scientist. He's not talking about fasting the way we did 20 years ago. He's talking about it from the scientific point of view. He's one of the people that talks about the 8-16 fast, meaning you should only eat within a window of 8 hours and fast for 16 hours, right? And that window is getting shorter and shorter for some people. It's got really good science. Walter Longo, director of the University of Southern California Longevity Center Institute, does what he calls the fasting mimicking diet. Fasting mimicking diet, meaning that you eat regular for 25 days of the month, and for 5 days you fast in a mimicking diet, taking maybe 600 calories for 5 days. He's found that his research shows that you can get the same benefits as fasting 5 whole days without food, right? Well, what's the importance of that? Well, fasting then shows that it can correct things like the protein folding in the brain, can prevent Alzheimer's disease, heart disease. It can, with 72 hours, 3 days of fasting, can reset your whole immune system. So I would write that down, look it up. 72 hours of fasting can reset your whole immune system and make it brand new again. That's Walter Longo's contribution. And we knew that people were doing that a long time ago, you know. Not because they read his research, but because the absence of food, right, in our societies. Krista Veraday also has written about fasting. She's done a lot of good research too. Her fasting regimen is like for a month, you know, every other month or every few months of the year. Eat one day, fast the next day. Eat one day, fast the next day. People call that the warrior diet now. But there's something to that, because when you look up ancient Sparta and you look up warriors and that sort of thing, you'll find out that's what people did. They were at their highest point when they went into battle, when they didn't eat, right? But they had to eat some, otherwise they'd be too fatigued in battle. They were sharper, their mind clarity was better, they were braver, and so on and on. But what was going on were all these molecular kinds of things that were going on with them. So it was natural. Mental health. Fasting is something that cures anxiety and depression and other mood disorders. And it pushes up the brain-derived neurotrophic factor again. You know, again, I keep on talking about the brain here and the rise of new brain cells and the increase of cognitive reserve, right? That is like all these different things. So you can think about how powerful and how abundant the cells in the brains of these indigenous people used to be at that time. The Chimene Indians that Sanjay Gupta was talking about, they fit this profile almost perfectly. Plus they got the parasites, right? But they also engage in intermittent fasting because, you know, there's only so much that's available. So I do it quite a bit. I do a lot of intermittent fasting, and I do long-term fasting. The longest I've ever fasted is 15 days just on water, right? And but there are other people that, you know, typically do a lot more days. I won't do that again, but it's not difficult, because when you get your body into this state, what they call autophagy, and I think it's Greek. Auto part means the body, and phagy is a big word now because it's all in all the sciences now, especially the immune sciences. Phagy is eating, self-eating. So what happens when you do the 72 hours of a fast, your body starts eating itself. But you know what it starts eating first? These organelles, these misshapen proteins. It starts eating bacteria and viruses. It starts consuming mutated cells, cancerous cells. That's all in the research, right? People have cured themselves of cancer by fasting over and over and over again. It's been replicated. You know, that's why, to me, in today's world, when we're exposed to so many toxins, toxic food, toxic air, toxic water, you know, we need to do this kind of thing and clean out. Very indigenous, I think. It's a very, very indigenous practice and a bit of knowledge. If you follow me on Facebook, that's what my plate says often. But this is really, I found this when I was doing some research. And this Jesuit missionary, Paul Lejeune, was among these Montaigne Indian hunter-gatherers in Canada, 1636. So he said this, he was observing them. I saw them in their hardships and labor suffer with cheerfulness. I found myself with them, threatened with great suffering. They said to me, we shall be sometimes 2 days, sometimes 3 without eating for lack of food. Take courage, Chinihi. Let thy soul be too strong to endure suffering and hardship. Keep thyself from being sad, otherwise thou wilt be sick. See how we do not cease to laugh, even though we have little to eat. And I thought, wow, this is really a powerful commentary on everything I've been talking about. We're talking about indigenous cultures that are in this stage of intermittent fasting, but laughing and having humor at the same time. And I thought, wow, I would love to have been there at that time to put them under a brain scan and to look at all the cognitive reserve they had in their body, right? So they're teaching this white Jesuit missionary about what it meant to be, alive, right? And he was like, Jesus fasted for 40 days, right? But he was having a tough time with 2 or 3 days. But it was regular for these native people to do that kind of thing. We evolved to fast. We got all the mechanisms for it. As I said, when we fast, we improve our glucose regulation. A lot of diabetes on my reservation. I did a DNA test and it said I have a 32 chance of getting diabetes. I don't have diabetes, right, from my 23andMe test. And one of the reasons is that I fast and I try to stay to a low-carb diet with a lot of fiber. But I've got 14 brothers and sisters and 11 boys and 4 girls, I should say, 15. And everyone in my family, including my mom and dad, got diabetes. My dad died at age 72 from diabetes-related complications. My mother's had diabetes for over 50 years. She's 92 years of age. Her mind is still as good as can be. I thought she would have had Alzheimer's by now. But she also has a genetic variant that protects her from mental decline as she gets older. So that came from way back. That's a gene that was passed down from way back. So it's really interesting to me. So improved glucose regulation. The loss of abdominal fat with the maintenance of muscle mass. If I took off my shirt right now, you'd see it. I'm kidding. So it's like blood pressure. Blood pressure among folks is high, Americans, among Native Americans, very high. Heart rate goes down. I've got a nice resting heart rate. My blood pressure is pretty good, although I stress and it goes up. Increased heart rate variability, similar to what occurs in trained endurance athletes. And heart rate variability is like you can test yourself, close your eyes, hold your throat here and breathe in. And your heart rate should speed up a little bit. And as you breathe out, it should slow down. Just try it. Close your eyes. Here, breathe in. And as you breathe out, it should slow down. And if it slows down, then your heart rate variability is working. It means you got good heart health. If you don't, then you got to get out there and start doing some exercise. Again, intermittent fasting, just like running, just like laughing, just like dancing, just like sleeping, just like everything we've been talking about, sitting in the sauna, improves learning and memory and motor function. The big thing about it here is that we're finding out now from the research is that it's a huge protective factor for neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or stroke or Huntington's disease. I was talking to a couple of guys just yesterday when I was in Fargo, or was it yesterday? Yeah, yesterday morning before I came. And they were sitting, and one guy was talking about one of his friends had a stroke. We were sitting in the sauna, and he was talking about how much beer he drank. And he said, what causes strokes? I said, beer. And of course, and I said, it's complicated. Strokes happen because plaque breaks off. That's one way it happens, and it gets, and you get a stroke. The brain is deprived of that. I said, but what keeps plaque stable, on your arteries is exercise, eating a right diet, and fasting every now and then so you don't get inflammation. I said, inflammation is one of the number one cause, and we eat a lot of inflammatory foods. Cookies, sodas, those kinds of things, right? I'm just telling you the research. I'm telling you the facts and stuff, right? But it's important to kind of think about, like, how do we improve health, right? So finally, this is what Mattson discovered. Intermittent fasting is beneficial for health because it imposes a challenge to the cells, and those are different cells, and those cells that we have respond by adapting to the ability to cope with the stress and resist disease. Now, I haven't eaten for about 23 hours. Am I hungry? As Pete the cat would say, goodness no. So some people know Pete the cat, right? I love Pete the cat, man. Everything's good. But your body adapts, it really does. I know when I'm out of sugar, my body starts burning ketones, burning fat, and it's a higher form and a better fuel for my brain than glucose is, right? That's what most of the research shows. Indigenous people, back in the day, probably burned a lot of ketones, a lot of fat rather than glucose, because glucose is very short. So we have those regulators and we have the genetics to burn more glucose and to get into a state of autophagy, self-eating, where we eat up the bacteria, the viruses, the mutated cells, we eat up the mutated organelles, all these different things that causes problems in cancer. That's what fasting does. We don't have to do it every day, but it's like a maintenance thing. If you can do it every day, at least for 12 hours or 14 hours, your last meal at 6 o'clock, don't eat until 6 o'clock in the next morning. I wasn't a person like that. I used to snack at night. Got a snack at night. Open that fridge. Let me have something here, Got to have a popcorn or whatever it is, But, now I've changed those habits some time ago, and because of the diabetes in my family. But let's go on. Wow. Ways of knowing, being outside, right? How many people have heard of that term, nature deficit disorder? Heard of that? So a few people have had that. Now there's a research going on about why the newest miracle drug, besides running and sleeping and fasting and sitting in the sauna and dancing and all those kinds of things, is being outside. Imagine that, huh? I have another cool slide. I couldn't find it, but there's a slide of these native kids in boarding school talking about how they had to learn about the animals and birds in class rather than actually being out in nature, right? That was colonization. Put all these kids in these schools rather than keeping them out in the environment. No wonder you have so much damn depression among natives. They're not outside. They're not on the environment. We evolved to be in the environment, right? Now, most of us have nature deficit disorder, because you mentioned 2 or 3 hours out there. You saw the Tarahumara are out there 4 to 6 hours in nature every day, moving, right? That's a norm for human beings, minimum. For the Chamane Indians in the Bolivian rainforest that Sanjay Gupta talked about, 19,000 steps a day. That's about 8.5 miles, 9 miles a day, every day, just moving and walking, right? So you got your Fitbit says you got to make 10,000. You're only halfway there, right? But we evolved to move. So we're not well. That's, again, one of those indigenous ways of knowing, right? So this is kind of what this one article talked about, the proliferation of electronic communications, the poor urban planning, disappearing of open space, street traffic, diminished importance of the natural world, all these things are, magnified by, news and media entertainment, right, to be in these places. All this expanding body of, Western-based, evidence, right? Like we knew this before, but they had to tell us again, right? Nature deficit disorder contributes to diminished use of the senses, attention difficulties, conditions of obesity, and higher rates of emotional and physical illnesses. Now, it's become so big now in social work and psychology, it's called forest therapy that the Japanese do. Have you ever heard of that, forest therapy? It's like, oh, this is brand new, Now, I mean, people have been doing this side of the planet for like 100,000 years, being out in the, that was part of who we were as indigenous people. But now, all of a sudden, Western science has validated it, right? So I'm just here to tell you that this is what we used to do, right? But higher rates of emotional and physical illnesses and nature deficit disorder weakens the ecological literacy. Imagine that, right? And stewardship of the natural world. Something that, I'm really glad to see, because many of my students and many places I've been, people are fighting those fights to try to keep, nature and the environment at the forefront, to keep it healthy, right? And indigenous people around the world are fighting these fights. I teach courses in indigenous studies. I travel around the world to indigenous communities, and I see that people are trying to keep, other people literate about the ecological sort of circumstances and situations. The epidemic of inactivity. right? And the devaluing of independent play. So this is outside, sort of one of the last parts there. So I mentioned all these different kinds of things, being outside in the cold and the heat, being in a hot sauna, running, fasting, all these different kinds of things. And I talked about adaptive, cell activity. When you're put under stress, the brain has the ability to cope. There's resilient coping in the VMPFC. That's the ventral medial prefrontal cortex in the front part of the brain. And again, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I try to remember these things. How do I remember this and where it's at? And I think, ventral medial prefrontal cortex. Where is it at? Well, it's kind of in the lower part of the hemispheres and the frontal part of the cortex. And it's kind of doing all the work, holding up, the rest of the brain, just symbolically. So I think, that must be the very mad private first class, right? This grunt is doing all the work. He's doing all the work to take care of that brain, so he's mad. But that's how I remember that, VMPFC, very mad private first class, taking care of our brain down there, right? So when you look at these images, you see that resilient coping and activation in the VMPFC. The risky coping on the other side is not there. That's going to lead to all kinds of emotional disorders and distress. It's going to lead to all kinds of different kinds of problems of adaptation to difficult conditions. What we know, though, in the second part, prior experience based upon indigenous cultures, prior experience of training young men and young women how to deal with high levels of stress and uncertainty improves cognitive resilience. And I've been telling the story for a while. When I was in Northern California, when I was the director of the MSW program at the Humboldt State University, I worked directly with the Yurok people. And I got to talk to a lot of elders and a lot of people and cultural folks there. And I learned of some of their stories. And one of the stories that really sort of brought me back to this resilient coping and was what they did with their young people. And I read about the young men. Young men, 10, 9, 11 years old, would put on their grass skirts, be topless, maybe have their moccasins on. They'd have a cedar band, headband, maybe an eagle feather and a prayer stick, and they would have to run up into the mountains. Cold. It's cold. Northern California is cold. And they have to run through the mountains and sing and pray as they ran through the mountains. At night, without a flashlight. This was, a long time ago. And this was, I forget the anthropologist that was writing about this. And, of course, what was up in the mountains? Grizzly bears, mountain lions. But something even more scary than that, mountain spirits, unpredictable. You're on my mountain, And they had to run up to the mountains, and they all ran, and they had to keep up with one another, right? They came down, and they run, and they come back to the village. And they had to do it different places in the mountains. They did it over and over again. Stress, uncertainty. They then, based on this model, began to develop resilient coping. How do I know that? At the end of this article that talked about it, and talking with the elders, this anthropological article, these particular people that were part of the society that did that became the most courageous people in the tribe. They were strong. They were very healthy. And they were very generous and kind. Wow. I didn't know that compared to this, because I hadn't seen this until very recently, this particular image. But when I looked up the image, then I found out the ventral medial prefrontal cortex is not only part of the prefrontal cortex in our brains, but it's also in the frontal lobe. And it's implicated in the processing of risk and fear, the risk of going up into those mountains and the fear that existed. In order to overcome that fear, they had to have inhibit their emotional responses. They had to just be brave if they did that. They couldn't be afraid. And it was also implicated in the process of decision-making and self-control. Where should I run? How should I run? And how should I control my thinking and my emotions? And in the very end, this story of these young Yurok boys, they also was involved in the cognitive evaluation of morality. Then it made sense. They became the most generous, had high morals in the community, in the tribe. And I said, that's resilient coping. There it is. This is indigenous knowledge now, because most tribes did this, rites of passage with kids. When you challenge yourself or the people, and you give them experience to deal with high levels of stress and uncertainty, right? Not overstress them, not traumatize them, but you develop the cognitive resilience in that part of the brain. Now that's a gem. Social workers, pay attention to that. Those are the things that come from indigenous knowledge that you can begin to use and say, if kids are involved in this kind of thing, you can develop resilient coping so that as they get older, trauma and all these other things that exist in their life will not be so traumatic. So adverse childhood experiences, that's a Western idea, it's a Western concept, because indigenous people had already figured out how to deal with adverse childhood experiences, right? They prepared kids to be strong and healthy. So I'm going to go on to the next section here. It's kind of long, but does anybody have any questions at this point? Questions, comments? Are you finding this interesting at all? Yeah? Interesting? They'll buy my book when it's done. Okay. So, any questions, please ask. So now I want to get to the great new circle of life, right? Understanding at this other level who we are. So you get down to this part of the medicine wheel, the body part. So, who are we? Well, we're basically bacteria, fungi, and viruses, and other parasites and microscopic organisms that reside inside of us and outside of us. They're in our nose, our ears, our hands, our armpits, our butts, our mouth and intestines. And very, very important now. The research has shown us that really important roles that they play in terms of the digestion of our food, preferences they have for food, peaking our immune systems, improving our cognition, our mental health, and helping protect us from certain diseases. Or if we don't eat right, they raise the possibility of certain diseases. What's interesting is that men and women, different, and it makes a lot of sense. Women have more lactic acid bacteria, which is similar to things like yogurt and pickles and wine than men's hands. Men's have a bacterium that plays a role in synthesizing monosodium glutamate, or MSG. I always joke and say that's probably why men like Chinese buffets more. But if I was doing an assessment as a social worker now today, and I had kids with emotional issues or mental health issues, one of the things I'd ask them is that, were you a C-section baby, or were born vaginally from the birth canal? We know that from a lot of studies now that babies that were C-section babies did not get bathed in the good bacteria from mom. And a lot of those babies go on to develop autoimmune disorders or mental health disorders, asthma, anxiety disorders, and so on. There's a higher probability. We know that's how important it is being exposed to that when babies are going through the canal, the vaginal canal, right? Otherwise, they're exposed to things that are in the operating room. The doctor may have some disease, or a nurse may have some illness or something that's on that can touch them. Even though we've got rubber gloves on, they still reside in the room, and they're floating in the room. We know that, antibiotics, again, this is another, assessment question. When's the last time you had antibiotics? How many people have had antibiotics in their lifetime? Most of us, I think, have. When's the last time we've had antibiotics? With the last year? How many have not had antibiotics in years? Like 10 years, 20 years. So one person? Oh, okay, yeah. Yes. Yeah. A for the day. Absolutely. You know, we're eating chicken, pork, beef, anything that has, you know, been raised in an industrial, you know, CAFO, they call them, you know, concentrated animal feeding operation. We're getting antibiotics. And that's not good for us, you know, not for any of us. It's not indigenous, right? It's not, I try to find this quote, but I'm sure it was by Sitting Bull, but the first time they brought cattle and they were trying to make the Lakota eat buffalo, they didn't want to eat, or beef, they didn't want to eat the beef. So look at that cow is dumb, you know, it's not brave, it's not strong like, you know, like a Tatanka, you know, Tatanka, the buffalo, right? He said that we're going to have consequences if we eat this meat here, right? It was true, you know, I mean, back then they didn't use antibiotics. Back then they're probably grass-fed beef, so it's just healthier for them, but you know, buffalo are leaner, they got higher omega-3 fatty acids and other profiles that are healthier for us. You know, so yeah, you're right. We all get antibiotics if we eat, you know, regular meat. And some of us are getting the antibiotics from the shot. And I'm not an anti-vaxxer, by the way, but you know, you know, there's a consequence to that, right? So it changes the microbiome, makes us unhealthy. So then we wonder about, like, why are these kids so depressed, or why are they so upset, why are they so angry, why are they freaking out, you know, or what's going on with them? Well, we know now from the human microbiome studies is that, you know, we've disrupted this great circle of life, right? Oh, radiation therapy, chemotherapy, those kinds of things. We know that the microbiota differ in individuals. Lean versus those who are, you know, obese or overweight. I've had my microbiome tested. I used to show it sometimes, you know, and this takes a long time to get through that. But you know, if you have particular microbiome, microbiota, you know, you have a lower risk of atherosclerosis or heart disease and diabetes and metabolic syndrome. You know, like you know, hypertension, those kinds of things. Those are things that are all having a conversation with the brain. The conversation that goes on between the great circle of life here and the brain is two-way, right? These are living organisms inside of us. But this is kind of a really interesting slide here, why it's difficult to switch to a healthy diet with a lot of plants, give up the sugars and breads and all those kinds of things, because there's an evolutionary pressure that's exerted, right? So you think about kids in school, you think about kids in an institution, you think about adults, you know, if you're working with adults at, you know, in any kind of institution or anyone, we realize that, you know, there's a certain kind of menu that are fed to people, and generally the American standard diet is very high in processed foods and sugar and salt and different kinds of bad fats like trans fats. And that breeds different kinds of populations of microbiota in the belly, microbes. So this particular research says that microbes in the gastrointestinal tract are under selective pressure, right, to manipulate host eating behavior to increase their fitness, meaning that, you know, they want to increase their numbers, they don't want to die off. So they actually manipulate us, you know, at the expense of our health. Whether we get too, you know, frail or we get, you know, too obese or whatever it is, the science is now showing it's not just us making the decision. The decision is happening in the gut by all these trillions of microbes, right? They do two potential strategies. One is generate cravings for foods that specialize on or foods that suppress their competitors. So, for example, if you've got a population called Akkermansia municiphilia, that's a good one. I like those. Akkermansia municiphilia gets you leaner, more muscle, you know, makes you healthier. If you get certain other ones that are inflammatory causing microbes, then of course what they do is cause diabetes, heart disease, those kinds of things. So there's a battle between these two species. One says, don't eat, fast, eat low-carb foods with a lot of plants, get enough sleep and whatever. And this one says, you know, Starbucks, right? Sugar. It's true. They want us, and so that's what we do. They win the battle or they win the battle. Consequences are there. So the second thing they do then is if we don't feed them what they want, and they are a major population of our gut, they induce this dysphoria until we eat foods that enhance their growth or their fitness. Well, dysphoria is like, I don't feel good. You ever hear the word hangry? Hangry? That's dysphoria, right? I'm not hangry. I've gone almost 24 hours without eating. I'm not hangry at all because my gut microbiome has changed. I don't do sugar. I don't drink soda. I don't drink juice, any sugars, I try to keep low carb as much as I can. A lot of nuts, a lot of seeds, and then I go without. So I used to have the battle, though, here. Believe me. I had the battle really bad going on. I got the dysphoria. I didn't feel right. I got hangry. I got headaches. I didn't feel right, so on. I used to eat at night at about 8 o'clock because I get so hungry, right? I mean, that's what happens after you eat a Chinese meal, right? Chinese food. So hungry, right? And if I didn't get it, then I'd have to drink a soda, eat a candy bar. That's what my dad used to do. My dad was diabetic. I had to go through, it was like going through addiction sort of withdrawal, right? So, well, there are, for indigenous people, indigenous knowledge, wild foods. Now, I'm not talking about decolonizing your diet by just eating, some of the foods we had in the agricultural period, the last 10,000 years, like squash and pumpkins and corn and beans. Those kinds of things, those are good. They're really important. But I want to take it past 10,000 years to talk about what our ancestors ate. Our ancestors ate a lot of wild foods. That's a traditional indigenous diet, and feeds a microbiome and feeds a healthy genetic expression. There's a Pomo woman here. She's demonstrating the gathering of traditional seeds. It's taken in 1924. This is one that kind of haunted me for a long time. This indigenous woman, she's Karuk. Her name is Phoebe Maddox. And she talked about world come to an end foods and talked about warnings from the spirit world that what we eat affects the health of our unborn and future generations. So here's a quote from her. Her first language isn't English, but what she said is, all did the same, the way that the spirit people used to do. And what the spirit people ate, that is what they ate. She's talking about their tribe, learning from the spirit people how to eat. They told them, you must eat this kind. The spirit people ate salmon. They spooned acorn soup, salmon along with acorn soup, and they ate deer meat. And they claimed that the spirit people had 2 meals a day. That's their intermittent fasting there. And they also did only that way. When the whites came, then they said, they eat poison food, world come to an end food. World come to an end food. The middle-aged people were the first to eat the white man food. When they liked it, they liked it. They told each other, it tastes good. They said, he never died. I'm going to eat it, that bread. But the old men and the old women did not eat it until way late. We are the last ones that know how the spirit people used to do, how they used to eat, the way our mothers told us. And even we do not eat anymore what they told us to eat. And what will they, who are raised after us, do? So I think that was really prophetic, because we know what happened. We got diabetes, heart disease, and cancer. We died early, We followed a Western way of eating. We didn't follow a traditional way of eating. This is Phoebe Maddox back in 1932. Yeah. Another warning from this Pomo woman, Tono Otam woman, Maria Chona. She's 90 years old out there. Before agriculture, there were wild foods. All the year round, we were watching where the wild things grew so we could pick them. Elder brother planted those things for us. He told us where they were, where they are, and how to cook them. You would not know this if it had not been given. You would not know you could eat cactus stems and shake the seeds out of the weeds. Elder brother did not tell the whites that. To them he gave peaches and grapes and wheat, but to us he gave wild seeds and cactus. These are good foods. Here's Maria again, Jonah. She probably, like me, had gluten intolerance. Wheat flour makes me sick. I think it has no strength. But when I am weak, when I am tired, my grandchildren make me gruel out of the wild seeds. That is food. So it's not just that it's wild seeds, people. What it is that we have a genetic inheritance to eat that way. That's when we operate most effectively. That's when we operate most efficiently. We got these elders long ago giving us warnings, telling us what to do, how we should do this. See? And that's the important thing. If we remember that, we stay well. If we don't stay well. So, how can we restore the environment so that the wild things grow again? We can harvest them. That's the big thing that we know now, that when the domestic plants are gone and they die because they have never survived climate change, the wild things have. They got it in their seeds, the genetic memory of survival. The next generations will learn how to eat those again. That makes sense. That's the microbiome. Why don't we go ahead and take another stretch again, 5-minute stretch. We'll get into this next part here. So grab yourself a cookie. I mean, kidding. Just get up and take a stretch, whatever. So maybe I'll go to about 3:30 or so. Or 4:30, yeah. I get 3:30 because I haven't changed back yet. And then, okay, folks, let's get in the spirit of things. Spirit of things. Spirit. So I've got this next part of the medicine wheel, the indigenous mindfulness contemplative practices part. The science and art of mindfulness, the power of the mind, neurodecolonization, and contemplative practices. This is my second youngest daughter. She's 6 now, and she's meditating. All my girls. I got 4 girls. I got 4 grown sons, and I got 4 little girls. And a few more years, I'll have another 4 somewhere, something like a res dog. No, I'm kidding. Like a res dog. No, I do have 4 little girls. And they meditate, right? They meditate because I really understand the importance of a balanced mind and so on. And yesterday, one of my daughters was having a meltdown, so I said, more meditation. So she's meditating anyway. Her name is, we call her Banaji, but her name is Bachiparinut. In my language, that means the new moon. It's a woman's name. Bachiparinut Diduhu means the new moon, she's beautiful, right? And she's meditating, and it's staged, right? Because I told her, I want to take a picture of you meditating. I don't want to take a picture of you meditating. Can I watch Netflix? Okay. So got her to meditate. But, so what about this? I've been talking about microbes and fasting and the land and the earth and indigenous ways of knowing. But mindfulness, Western mindfulness, I'll call it, because people have taken over mindfulness now, and it's all over the place. And you can get, for $10,000, you can get certified to be a mindfulness teacher and so on. And but one of the things about mindfulness as indigenous people is that we recognize that we're connected to a natural world. We evolved to be connected to a natural world. And we have a genetic past of our ancestors from this part of the world that still is in our DNA. We know that because our minds have been colonized and inherited certain kinds of markers, traumatic markers, and have been sculpted by living in a Western world, the thoughts we think, the emotions, the beliefs of our ancestors back then, the foods we eat, and the environment we were exposed to, that we have to constantly check in with ourselves about what it is that's going on in our minds and our whole bodies for that matter. Well, mindfulness has many definitions. I have some really cool ones, but this is an old slide, so I'll just go with what I have here. But, you know, basically being mindful, right? Maintaining the state of being non-judgmental, you know, awareness is really high of our thoughts and emotions, and we can sort of be in our body and in the experience from moment to moment as things sort of unfold, right? Awareness. That's the definition of mindfulness. So meditation is a little different. And I really like this slide because I look at this monk here, this Tibetan monk here, sitting inside of a cave, meditating, probably on a 3 or 4 year retreat, whatever. And every day he gets into this state of meditative quality, right? And focusing on an object, right, is part of meditation, or a phrase, or a word, or a sound, or a visualization. Focus it on our breath, movement, like if you're dancing or singing or attention. We want to increase the awareness of the present moment, reduce stress, promote relaxation, and of course, the big thing is to enhance spiritual growth and enlightenment. So it's not about what a lot of the people do in mindfulness today. When you see the Fortune 500 companies like Google, or any of these companies, Amazon, or whoever they are, or Silicon Valley, they're having all their people do mindfulness so they can be better in their jobs rather than be better human beings, right? There's no spiritual growth. It's probably all towards the bottom line. The end product is greater profits. But we know a lot of dynamic things happen in the brain when people train their attention or their awareness to focus, right? So a little model that I put together is of the Buddha in the middle. I always like to say that the Buddha is indigenous because he came from the Shakya tribe, and all the teaching and learning at that time were very indigenous beliefs and values. He was come from a warrior class as well. So in this particular model, mindfulness is about this. It's about non-judgment of the experience you're having, right? Buddhists say that, the body is an illusion. A lot of these things are an illusion because they don't last, right? Things move. We don't attach to things, which I think is a very important indigenous idea, non-attachment. I tell stories every now and then about how when I was growing up in my community, people used to say things like, it's where I think the giveaway sort of came from. I really like that hat. I really like that belt you have. And guess what? When a person said that, you took it off and you gave it away. I saw that many times when I was a kid. People would do that. They weren't attached to material things, right? So you say, well, I really like that belt buckle, so you give me a belt buckle. How about my kid, my really bad kid? Do you really like my really bad kid, right? No. That's my Indian humor there, so glad it worked a little bit. So non-attachment, paying attention, right, to what's going on. And like I said earlier, we're colonized by all these different things, like computers and all these other distractions. It's difficult to pay attention. I noticed that in my classes. I was teaching NDSU. I'm moving from teaching as a professor into an administrative management position as a dean. So I was telling my students I may never teach again, I may be done teaching at the university level. And it was kind of bittersweet because my first teaching job was in 1992. I was at the University of British Columbia, and I was really into teaching. By the time my last class rolled around, the difference between my class in 1992 and my class, at NDSU is that half the students were sitting looking at their computers or looking at their, they're looking at their phones, right? Then I saw this one cool statement by this professor that he would put up on his board before he started class. It says, I know you're looking at your phone because no one can stare at their crotch that long and smile. I said, that's clever, man. I'm going to put that up if I teach again, right? And that's what goes on, right? So paying attention. acceptance, right? Acceptance is the idea that you accept, what's ever going on in the moment of meditation. The pain, the distraction, the urge, the desires, the anger, whatever it is. Accept it, and then continue to focus on your breath or an object or whatever it is. And then always maintaining present moment awareness of where you are. Where am I? Okay. So if you look at these skulls in the corner there with the green, these are what they call the distraction demons. They're with us, right? Kind of as a joke, I put those up, but they're there to kind of distract us, right? Don't pay attention, And the other is sort of like intermittent fasting, right? Starve your distractions, feed your focus, right? Thich Nhat Hanh, Vietnamese practitioner, mindfulness practitioner. When we look at mindfulness approaches, there are all these different things: sitting meditation, walking meditation, eating, listening, monitoring, belly breathing. And then there are these other practices like loving kindness, or they call metta, like breathing in, like may I be well, breathing out, may the whole world be well, body scan. These are a lot of exercises I do with folks. I've done meditation and mindfulness research projects on different reservations, one on the Yurok Reservation, one on the White Earth Reservation. I'm connected to one now where I helped the Blackfeet Buffalo Hide Academy get funded, so they have a mindfulness program out there. So most of these folks have read my work, or they've read the research and decided that what they want to do is turn their children back into toward more traditional practices of mindful contemplative practices. So mindfulness for them, the simple act of sitting and breathing and training your awareness, is like a springboard. Training your mind to pay attention, then they springboard into their Blackfeet practices, their ceremonial practices, so they get better at those practices. They're not distracted, and so on. There's also mindfulness, resilience practices, talked about building resilience. So the benefits of mindfulness meditation, right? So this is the Western science, but we know that closing your eyes or sitting and focusing and concentration does a lot of good things to us besides make us feel good. Preserves the aging brain, calms down, and this is a big indigenous one, activity in the brains. It's all about me center and makes us part of the group. Big for those of you that work with people that have anxiety or depression disorders and those kinds of things. Very good research on it rivaling antidepressants and depression and so on, anxiety. Big thing about it too is that volume changes in the brain. Big changes in the white matter. I'll go over that a little more, and also in the gray matter of the brain. The white matter, connectivity in the brain, the gray matter, protein in the brain that helps preserve different parts of the brain. Just a few days of training improves concentration and attention. That's how quickly it works. It's cheap, doesn't it's not hard to implement. It's relatively it's culturally neutral, and it works. Reduces anxiety, and it's big, helping people with all kinds of addictions. The power of belief, the power of the mind. I'll just mention a couple of stories, about people's belief power. One story was about, I read about Candace Pert, who was a neuroscientist. I think she worked for the National Institute of Mental Health. And in 1990, she was interviewed by Bill Moyers, who was this public television guy. I don't know if anybody knows who Moyers is. I don't think he's on TV anymore. But back then, he was really big. And she talked about neuroscience literature and about different personalities in neuroscience and about the power of the mind. That was the Mind and Healing was the name of the book by Bill Moyers. So if you get it, it's 1990, but it's still pretty fascinating about the power of belief. And she said, in the archives of neuroscience, she said, we have a lot of stories about the power of belief, but we never really talk about it much. We just call it placebo effect. And he said, tell me one of the stories. And she told a story about what we used to call multiple personality disordered people that had more than one personality. And she had, this particular person she talked about had 3 personalities, right? First was Mo, second was Larry, the third was Curly. And this person had 3 personalities. So, and each personality had different diseases, but one of them had no diseases. And she's telling Bill Moyers this. She said, when this person is Mo doesn't have any diseases. But when he becomes Larry, he has diabetes. Diabetes shows up. And then when he becomes Curly, he gets cancer. And it shows up on the x-rays. The tumors show up. But when he goes back to being Mo again, guess what? It all goes away. Something's going on there when the person shifts their brain to being a totally different person, that it sends into motion a number of different processes in the body. So if you're interested in reading more about that, look up Candace Pert, look up Bill Moyers, look at that. There's also a book, I'll remember the book in the second, but it's all about placebo that's been done, by a number of really good scientists, how important that is. So how do you get into that state of belief, right? Well, first of all, you have to clean out the colonization and the trauma, and you have to stabilize the brain, right? This is what we know about trauma. Very disturbing, death of your child, the death of a parent, the death of a loved one. And we know that unless we prepare ourselves and become cognitively resilient for the trauma, like the Yurok people used to do with their kids by sunning them up, running in the mountains, and swimming across the open ocean where there are great white sharks, creating uncertainty and stress, but yet they survive. They become more cognitively resilient because they have the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, the very mad private first class that's supporting them, that begins to activate. So when they hit trauma, they can walk through trauma. We've got an overabundance of trauma, historical trauma, that we talk about a lot. We're not talking about solutions. These are some of the solutions here. So trauma can colonize the body and the mind. Oh, what is it? Overwhelming the amount of stress, right, that exceeds our ability to cope or integrate the emotions involved with the experience. But again, like I said, the last one here is that many cultures had their own methods to prevent trauma and their own interventions to mediate it when it happened. But here's an underlying factor here. We have an evolutionary experience in history and a legacy of fear, mistrust, and uncertainty that we haven't responded to or taken care of. Kevin Carter, who was a famous photographer, took this picture of this famine that was going on in the South Sudan. Very famous picture. I think it was in, I don't know if it was in Life or National Geographic. Has anyone ever seen this picture? So a couple people have seen this picture. But at the time, it showed the struggling and civil war that was going on. And this little boy was trying to make it to this feeding station. Good news is he eventually made it. He was helped. But, when we look at that, we have a sense of fear, a sense of compassion. These are all part of it, and a sense of uncertainty. We evolved to have that. That was one of the things that helped us survive, right? We all have traditional narratives of our struggles, our survival, our triumph, and our fears. All the genesis and origin stories of all people have these different elements in there, right? But what we know from evolutionary biology, that we as human beings have fear because we have fear of death, of being eaten by predators, inclement weather, starvation, strangers, difference, being alone, marginalized, all these fears that still are part of our markers that we don't even think about, right? And to deal with fear and uncertainty in our lives, what we did as people back then and we do with people like today is we run away, we hide, we kill others, we murder others, we defer to them, we join them, we bargain with them, we create distractions, we enslave them, we create weapons to fight against one another. Or we learn how to harness the power of the group to go to war we increase our numbers, or we commit suicide. Suicide's not new. It's something that's been there when people get overwhelmed. That's part of our evolutionary heritage. But we also have the narratives of fear and trauma in our history. If you look at all cultures, they have monsters and giants. You know, go after kids. Spots. It's really interesting research I was reading about spots. When they showed babies, different patterns. Babies would look at different patterns. And when they showed them spots, they would become more alarmed and they would hold their focus more on spots. Why? Well, evolutionary biologists believe that we have that marker in our brains because what made a meal of us, we were on the menu of ancient leopards for a long time. You know, we have all these evolutionary fears. Predators, dangerous animals. There's narratives of bad spirits, scary places. We're scared of the dark. We're scared of the night. We're scared of sharp objects. Poisonous creatures like snakes and spiders. We're scared of fast-moving creatures like wasps and bees and mice. Inclement weather. And these are all recounted in stories, music, and paintings and symbols. So when we try to address trauma today, we don't even take into account our evolutionary fears and our evolutionary stories. That's why fear will always be with us, right? So the world remains a hostile place, and unless we learn how to adapt, or are given the opportunity to adapt, we have issues and problems. So our evolutionary history influences our brain development, our genetics, our culture, and our response to trauma, right? And we have trauma genes. It's cool. I was getting scared there for a minute. I was like, I'm glad he's doing that sacred walk. Yeah. He called out the light spirits. Okay. You know, a species evolved to have certain characteristics and traits that ensured survival. But why have humans become the masters and conquerors over all other species on the planet? Because of our ability to cooperate, right, in large numbers. Not too many other animals do that in large numbers. Elephants do that, wolves do that, you know, cooperate, and, you know, lions do that. But not too many other species do that. Humans do it. The biggest is why we've kind of, that's why we're in the state we are right now. We've kind of destroyed the planet and destroyed other species. We almost wiped out the grizzly bear. We almost wiped out the wolf. We almost wiped out the buffalo. We almost wiped out the eagle, all these other species. Other species, and, you know, don't do that, right? We're born into a hostile environment, you know, if we don't fit the design. And so what's left over then in our trauma are the ancient traumas and adaptations. For example, how many people have ever gotten goosebumps? Most of you? Most people got goosebumps. And you're not a goose, right? Okay. Anybody know why we get goosebumps? Okay. Well, evolutionary biologists tell us that we get goosebumps because of fear. And they don't serve us any good right now, but when we were mammals with a lot of hair, when we got goosebumps, our hair would stand up to make us bigger, more fearful, right? That's the theory. Makes sense. There's a lot of, you know, stuff that we still have that are left over. That palmar grip reflex. Mothers know about that. Anybody know what that is? Yeah, what is? Yeah, when you put your finger like this, the baby grabs, right? Palmar flex. You know why the baby grabs like that? Anybody? It's an evolutionary thing again. Again, this is just what the science from Western science tells us. The baby grabs like that to grab to the hair of the mother to hang on because the mother is going to leave. That's the cue. So it grabs onto the hair of the mother, not your hair on your head, the hair that was on your back, and, you know, hangs on. So palmar grips exist in the primates. They also exist in humans, right? It's hard to get away from that. It's not the everyday kind of social work you study, right? Palmer grip. So contemporary traumas and adaptations are assimilation and colonization. So I'm going to just finish with these last few slides here, and then I've got some more tomorrow. But this is the Kill the Indian, Save the Man. I'm a member of the National American Indian Boarding School and Healing Association. I'm on the board of directors, and for the first time I was out to Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Had my great-grandpa went to school out there. And, you know, it's interesting when you walk on the grounds. You even got a chance to see the places where they imprisoned the kids. You know, all these kids. On the near the grounds were all the cemetery. So were all the kids that were there that never returned home. Somebody said, yeah. And they're trying to tear down some of them now, and we have a farmhouse there that we're trying to preserve. My grandfather used to work at that farmhouse when he was at Carlisle. But these are some of the, where can you go in the United States to find cemeteries behind schools, Indian boarding schools, all across this country? I went to a boarding school. I graduated from a Catholic boarding school. A lot of my brothers and sisters did. My mom went to a boarding school. My grandparents went to boarding school. We're all boarding school survivors in my family. So this is like the banning of all these things I was talking about. These indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing and ceremonial practices, because running was a ceremony. Going into the sweat lodge was a ceremony. Intermittent fasting was a ceremony. These are all ceremonial things, right? So this teller ordered an end to all heathenist dances and ceremonies on the reservation due to the great hindrance to civilization. Now we're civilized and we're dying off. Thomas Jefferson Morgan, another Indian commissioner, suppressing native religions by ordering penalties of up to 6 months in prison for those who repeatedly participated in religious dances or acted as medicine men. This is my reservation here, and that man's crying is one of my relatives, George Gillette. If you've ever seen this picture on the internet, this is what happened to our people. Our land was taken away. Our sacred burial grounds, our sacred, birthing grounds, everything that was culturally important to the people was flooded out by the Army Corps of Engineers and the U.S. Congress in the United States. And this is the guy Kruger, who was the commissioner at that time. And they're signing away this land, and flooding it out. Really a big part of our reservation. And the thing about it is that when you look at these guys, they kind of look more like me than they really look like, because they dressed up to be more Western, put on ties, cut their hair, suits on. And, they didn't dress traditional anymore because they wanted to show the white man that we're civilized, we're like you. Treat us with respect, honor the treaties. See, we're not savages anymore. But, of course, that didn't work. Their land was taken away. Our land was taken away. It was flooded. And after that happened, all these really horrible markers, health, behavior, violence, suicide, alcoholism, all followed. What happens when you break up a collectivist culture? They don't laugh anymore. They don't go into ceremony anymore. They don't run anymore. They don't sleep well anymore. They don't eat like they used to eat. They all become impoverished in their their body, mind, and spirit. And so this is what happened to our people. So I want to start here tomorrow and show you how these systems get colonized and the problems that happen to that. But I want to end in a good way to kind of tell you again, to return to things that can help us here. So I want to end with that today, and I want to thank you for your attention. I guess I'm on again tomorrow, so thank you.
Okay. All right, so we are going to finish up for this afternoon with a couple of things. If you will, again, open your packets and find an evaluation form. We have one form, but we're going to have one for today and one for tomorrow as well. So you don't need to write your names on these. These are anonymous evaluations, but if you will circle whether you're today, if you're filling it out for today, day 1, so we know which your comments apply to, that will be helpful. And then tomorrow, if you're coming back, we'll have you do a second one. But if you will, as you're doing this, take a moment to think back to earlier in the day when we were setting up what our expectations were for our learning. If you can reflect on that and use that reflection as a part of filling out that evaluation, that will be very helpful to us. And I'm going to ask you now, for those of you that are coming back tomorrow, as you're processing what you've learned, if some of you will think about sharing in the morning again about what you learned today to help bridge us into tomorrow's discussion. There will be some folks here tomorrow that probably weren't here for this part of the day or this part of the training as well. And then while you're doing that, we have a drawing for some door prizes. And I'm going to bring the microphone back to the back of the room.
So Ani, I'm Pamela,
Tanya.
and we're gonna answer a couple of the questions that are breaking, and I want to learn more. In your folders, Andrew made you a pretty quarter sheet paper that says follow the Native American Center for more resources. It should be a black half sheet, if I'm correct. It's the same as this white slip back here. We put together a list of 20 different resources that we found helpful, that we found when we researched and did our board, that you guys can take. There's PDFs in there, there's PowerPoints. Yeah, the little quarter sheet, and there's some on the back. It has some groups that you can follow, like social media groups that have lots of information, along with some movies and documentaries that talk about this and the facts. So there's that one. The next one is people need to wake up to this crisis, and you can find more how to spread awareness on that. And again, how can you advocate for it? So everybody that's in this room, we put your name in a bucket. You want to draw? Okay, so the first one, let's take them all away. The first one is a northern cell phone holder.
Melissa Leopard.
Okay. Karen, you are getting a northern new logo cup. Connie Hemela. Is Connie still here? Yes. No. Okay. She's winning. Do you want to draw again? Draw again. Okay. So the next one that we draw, you are getting a set of birch bark earrings with porcupine quills on it that a northern graduate just made. Suzette, she's a native student. So, Kimberly Rulick. Yeah. And the last drawing for today, Tanya made a pop socket for your cell phone, and it's beaded. Grace. Also, in the back, we put together little SEMA tie pouches if you guys want to take a couple with you. And then don't forget to take your picture in front of the hands board.
Okay. So as you finish up your evaluations, if you will just leave them on the front table in a stack, then we will be sure to take those up. All right. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing most or all of you tomorrow.